Okay, well, welcome everybody to this afternoon's English Australia webinar, all about improving listening skills. I'd like to welcome our presenter, Tanja Hafenstein. Tanja's had a long and impactful career in English language teaching. She's currently a TESOL language teacher, learning advisor, and professional development committee member at UQ College in Brisbane. She's an experienced presenter and has shared her work at many conferences, including IATEFL in the UK, CamTESOL in Cambodia, and various conferences around Australia. Thanks so much for joining us today, Tanja.
Thank you, Sophie, and thanks everyone for joining. I don't need to introduce myself. Thank you. I'd like to just start with an acknowledgement of country. So I acknowledge the traditional custodians of country, the Yugambeh peoples, upon whose land I am presenting on today, and the land upon which my audience, you, is on today. We acknowledge our traditional custodians' connections to land, sea, and community, and pay our respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. So, I might wait for that for a moment. So yeah, I'm talking about all things listening. It's often one of our students' weakest skills. So I was really curious about helping my students develop their listening skills. And yeah, I'd often had these questions in my mind during class, and I think, well, you know, they know these words, why can't they hear them? You know, the speaker said X, but they hear Y. Why is that? Why doesn't it fit a connected speech rule? And does reading a tape script really help with listening problems? So these were some of the questions I had, and I began to investigate. And two books that had a real impact on me was Richard Cauldwell's A Syllabus for Listening, Decoding book, and John Field's Listening in the Language Classroom. And so many insights from these books I will share with you today. But one caveat, I'm not going to be able to cover all the decoding issues that exist. So today is a little bit of a taster. And also I have a Padlet with all this information, so you can kind of relax and just listen and enjoy. And there's a QR code you can scan with all this information. So I hope that helps. All right, so I have some questions we're not going to discuss, but I'd like you to ponder them in your mind for a couple of seconds and answer them to yourself. It's also our outline today. So what is decoding and why is this challenging for learners? How can the sound of words change in spontaneous speech? And what does decoding look like in everyday classroom practice? So just answer those questions in your head for a moment. So the first two questions will explore some key concepts and theory relating to the challenges of decoding and some of the processes that take place in spontaneous speech. And the last part will be some practical tools that I'll give you. So 5 activities that are easy to implement in your listening classroom. So the first key question, what is decoding and why is this challenging, is kind of 3 parts. What is it? And we'll discuss the challenges for the learners, but also for the teachers. I've just thrown that one in as well. So Richard Cauldwell describes decoding as the process of being able to decipher and recognize words in the sound substance. So just have a think. What do you think sound substance refers to? It refers to the acoustic sounds, so at phoneme level. And I think this quote really encapsulates decoding really well. There's this idea that there's this process or a series of actions that our students have to take to successfully decipher or to understand the words in this stream of speech. And it's almost like they have to solve a coded message sometimes. I'd like to share a little story with you. It's I was driving in the car with my kids, and Sia was playing on the radio, and I was proudly singing along to her song. I was, dancer, dancer. I thought it was sounding pretty good, and my kids started to laugh their heads off, and they say, "Mom, she's not saying dancer. She's saying that's love." And I went, "Oh, okay." I thought I heard these words, dancer. Then I continued to listen, and I was, "Oh yeah, she's saying that's love." So I deciphered these words in the song. And so here I am hearing these new words, that's love, and proudly singing along to the rest of the song to Sia. And I thought, oh, I'm going to test this out on my class. I wonder what they hear when they listen to this song. And so the plot thickens because I went to search for this song and I couldn't find it. Why do you think that is? I put in dancer, no song. I put in that's love, no song. And I went, oh, why can't I find this song? And then I noticed let's love, let's love, let's love, let's love. And so I went, oh my gosh, it's not dancer, it's not that's love, it's let's love. And I thought to myself, oh my gosh, how did that happen? I was convinced I heard dancer, the words dancer, then I was convinced I deciphered the words that's love. And I thought, oh wow, if an expert listener like myself can hear multiple hearings, multiple different phrases, what must our students experience, or what must our students hear? So that brings us to what are the challenges for our learners? So one challenge is Field highlights is the lack of word boundaries. So often we think, oh, it's, they don't understand the vocabulary. Yes, sometimes that's true, but it's often things related to the sound substance. So locating word boundaries in this example, the captains and cabin 8, we could hear many different combinations. So instead of captain, we might hear cap or capped. Instead of in, we might hear, instead of captain, we just hear the last part as tin, and you see the rest of the examples there. So that is one challenge. Another challenge is what Cauldwell calls the acoustic blur. And this refers to the wash of sound, this blur of sound whizzing past our students' ears, and words tend to blur together. They blend in with one another. Syllables blur and drop and change. And this becomes like a blur to our students. So to illustrate this, we're going to go on a botanic walk. So Cauldwell created these metaphors. This is a picture of a jungle. And have a little think, and how can the jungle relate to listening? So Cauldwell refers to spontaneous speech as, the jungle is a metaphor for spontaneous speech, because the jungle is, if you look at this picture, it's messy, it's unruly. You can get lost quite easily in the jungle. It's hard to find your way. Plants are all disorganized and blended together in a quite a chaotic way. So in spontaneous speech, it's very similar for our students. It's the words are all blended together in a chaotic and messy way, and you can get lost quite easily. So have a listen to this audio.
Know what I mean?
Just put a yes or a no or Y and an N in the chat. Could you understand what that audio? Yeah, we've got a yes from Becky. Yeah, so most of you as expert listeners could decipher those words. Don't worry, I'll tell you what those words are in a minute. Great, everyone had no problem. All right, so thank you for the yeses in the chat too, that really helps. Cauldwell refers, this is a scene of a garden, and this is a metaphor for connected speech. So just like the garden, the plants are semi-organized, lightly touching each other. You're not going to get too lost in the garden, and the flowers blend nicely together from one to another. And so similarly in connected speech, the words are lightly touching each other, blending together, and semi-organized. Connected speech helps us to understand how words blend together when they are closely linked. But it's also quite rule bound. So it's also often just at word boundary level, which is really good for intelligibility. But when it comes to decoding, we need to go a little bit further, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So let's see if you can decipher the words in the garden.
If you know what I mean.
Just a quick yes or no. Was that easy to decipher? Yes. Good. And was it a lot easier than the jungle? Yes, 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 yes. All right. Of course. And we have one more metaphor. This is the greenhouse. And maybe have a quick think, how does the greenhouse relate to listening? So the greenhouse, Cauldwell refers to this as a metaphor for citation forms. So the forms you would see in a dictionary. So just like these plants, they're isolated and separated from one another. There are no plants connected to them, and they are separated into pots. So similarly, in listening, or when we're listening to words, citation forms, they're by themselves. There's no other word around it. There's a pause or a breath before and after the word, and they're quite isolated, just like the greenhouse. So have a listen and tell me if you have any trouble deciphering what the words are.
If you know what I mean.
Yes or no, was that easy to decipher? Yeah, awesome. No, it was a no. All right. So to recap, all right, Cauldwell also mentions that it's important to know that words can have multiple pronunciations. So there's not just one way to say a word. It's not just the citation form. It's not just the sounds that we hear in a dictionary. So for example, if you know what I mean, sorry, if you know what I mean, can just reduce down to no. Yeah, so we've got know what I mean, if you know what I mean, to if you know what I mean. So that's quite a blur because we've gone from know what I mean to if you know what I mean. We start off with a phrase that has 13 segments or 13 individual sounds down to just 7. So it's no wonder our students kind of go, oh, I know the word, but I can't hear it. All right. This leads me to the teacher challenges, and I'll discuss one. It's what Cauldwell calls the blur gap. And I'd like you just to listen to the next words. So they've been. Can you tell me what the next words are?
So they've been good and bad.
I don't know if someone can really type quickly in the chat. Good and bad. Thank you, Fiona. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Penny. Yes, so the words that follow are good and bad. Was that difficult to hear? Just a quick yes or no. Not difficult. That's right. Easy to understand. So naturally for us as expert listeners, we have no trouble hearing the words good and bad. But the reality is we only heard mere traces, and this is what Cauldwell calls the blur gap. So we think we heard the citation forms. We think we heard good and bad very clearly, but actually we only heard mere traces. And we are kind of deaf in this way. It's hard for us to perceive a difference between what we hear. So we think we hear the actual words good and bad, and what we actually do hear, which is just the traces. I'm going to show you in more detail what these traces look like, but yeah, the blur gap is that idea that we hear the citation form but don't. Yes, and it's also important that we allow for this in the listening classroom so that we raise and we have an awareness of this when we're planning our listenings. Okay, so another problem is that the blur gap can also be exacerbated by course books, because course books can often focus on the meaning level or like the comprehension approach rather than the sound level, which is usually the culprit. So to illustrate, can you tell me what you hear next? What you hear, sorry?
Sorry, we can't come.
Is anyone a fast typer? Sorry, we can't come. Great, thank you, Becky. Yeah, so the audio was sorry, we can't come. To decode this, we need to break it down into 3 levels, which the 3 levels are, sorry, why is that not clicking? The meaning level, the word level, and the sound level. Which one do you think course books focus on the most? Meaning, yeah, usually it's the meaning. What do they mean by sorry, we can't come? Did they accept the invitation? Meaning, yeah, no, they didn't accept the invitation. That's right. So how do we reach this meaning level? How do we understand that they didn't accept the invitation? What do students need to do to decode that message? They have to understand the words. We assume that they heard the words, sorry, we can't come. Are these words difficult? Sorry, we can't come. Are these words difficult for our students? No. That's right. So if it's not the words, what's the problem? It's usually the sound. For example, did they say can come or can't come? Because that would change the meaning. The difference between yes, we can come or no, we can't come. So John Field states, the teacher's goal should not be to obtain correct answers to questions, but to discover more about the techniques and strategies employed by the respondents. So in other words, if we don't understand the process that our students go through to get to the answer, we just end up testing listening, or testing comprehension in the form of a product. For example, is the answer right or is the answer wrong? And the problem with that is if we're not checking the processes, if we're not checking how they arrived at the answer, we're testing listening, but we also don't know if they're getting the answers right for the right reasons, because you can get an answer right for the wrong reasons. It could be a lucky guess, and so on. So another problem is we can't see what's going on in the brains. So while they're listening, what's happening in the brain, in their brains, is invisible to us. And that's really hard as teachers. How do we help our students when we can't see the problem? I guess when we learn to be teachers, we learn to teach listening in ways that we can see things, like a connected speech rule, something we can see and show. So we have things that are more relatable, more teaching approaches that might have more rules to them, like connected speech is more rule bound. It's important, so it's important that we don't just stay in looking at tape scripts or connected speech rules, because they are quite rule bound. And also tape scripts, it's easier to decode something if you're reading it. So if we're helping our students decode what they listen to, of course, it's easier to understand what was said if we're reading it. We can inspect the words, we can go back and look at them, but it's not helping us with our listening. I don't want you to think that I don't want you to focus on connected speech or don't use tape scripts. I definitely think they are an important aspect to cover in class, but we also need to spend some time with decoding the jungle, spending time with the spontaneous speech and the messiness and the chaoticness, which is harder because it's not so rule bound and it's not something we can hang on to. So where does this leave the sound level? How do we help the students decode the sounds? We're going to look at how words can change, or how the sound of words can change in spontaneous speech. Welcome to the jungle. Welcome to the jungle. So here's some aspects that will help you to understand the processes that happen when you're listening to spontaneous speech. One feature is the consonant death. So Cauldwell talks, this is Cauldwell's term. He talks about how consonant sounds get dropped or blurred in spontaneous speech. And they don't necessarily have to happen at word boundary level. They can happen anywhere in the sound, stream of sound. So here are some examples. There's some meta language, but they're pretty self-explanatory. So for example, the T can often blur to a soft D sound. So little softens to little. Or a T can get dropped altogether in the middle of a word. For example, lil, I'm a little tired. Another example of consonant death is the hiss effect. Hiss effect means when there's an S sound that drowns out some of the surrounding sounds. So it's a lot of just becomes slaughter work. Have a little go by yourself and pronounce these changes. So say these phrases faster and see if you can notice those changes. The TH dropping and the consonant clusters dropping. And then he went. The festival just opened. All right. Another feature Cauldwell talks about is smoothing. So this relates to when diphthongs or double vowel sounds or long vowel sounds change to a single vowel sound. So for example, iya in weird changes just to wid. It's wid like that. Oya, royal, just changes to o, royal, the royal family. Have a go at saying these to yourself. I changes to a changes to a. Saying them quickly will help you to notice that smoothing. So these are some of the changes that can take place. There are many, 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 many more. And it really will depend on how sounds change can be affected by a lot of things that can be dependent on whether the sound is stressed, if it's prominent, if there's a pause before or after it. So there's lots of things to take into consideration. I've got one real life example. I recorded my daughter speaking, and I just thought it was a fabulous example of smoothing. So have a listen to what she says.
Do you know how to use that?
Could anyone decipher those words? It's a fast typer. I'll play it again.
Do you know how to use that?
Oh, great. Wow. Yeah. Do you know how to use that? Fantastic. Good listening. So we know what the speaker said. Do you know how to use that? Perfect. Think about, where do you think there is some aspect of smoothing going on in that recording? I'll play it again and see if which words might be smoothed out.
Do you know how to use that?
Yeah, great. It's a bit tricky writing that in the chat, isn't it? So the diphthongs and vowel sounds, you can notice them here. So the diphthongs are highlighted in blue and the long vowel sounds in orange. And when I analyze this, I notice the do you just becomes a ja. So instead of the long oo and you just becomes ya. The no just becomes na. How, ow just becomes ha. And to becomes da. So do you know how to just becomes jinada. Do you know how to use that? I felt, oh wow, this is so interesting. So much smoothing going on there. All right, so we've come to some classroom examples to demonstrate what we've been talking about. So the smoothing and consonant deaths. I did this earlier. Can anyone remember what the next words were?
So they've been good and bad.
Good and bad were the next words. What kind of do you think my students have real problems with this? Why do you think they had problems with this? I was so surprised what they gave me as answers. These were some of their answers. So they heard sleeping, bingo, good like that, at that, going back. And you can see there's confusion between the boundaries of the words. So being good has been interpreted as bingo, so that lack of word boundary. And what really surprised me was the sleeping part, because to me, I felt, the words are there for you. So they've been, you don't have to change those words. So I was like, how do you hear sleeping when the words have been given? And so when I was putting this presentation together, I thought, oh, I'll just check this. And I isolated those 3 words, and this is what you hear.
Sleeping.
Do you hear
Sleeping.
sleeping? Can you hear sleeping? Or do you still hear yes? When I heard that, I was like, oh, wow. It does sound like sleeping. It doesn't sound like so they've been. So it turns out my students had excellent hearing, and I had fallen victim to the blur gap. And this is what I mean. We don't realize that we're only hearing traces. So here are some of the reasons that they might have struggled. The hiss effect, the S drowning out some sounds around it. So they've become sleeping. And then we've got the consonant drops and some assimilation there. So good becomes good and bad. I'm just noticing the time, it's flying. So we've come to our last section. What does decoding look like in everyday classroom practice? So the first activity I'd like to share is a botanic walk. So Cauldwell talks about the jungle, the garden, and the greenhouse. And you can choose a problematic phrase, for example, the one we've been doing. So they've been good and bad. And I have these pictures printed out. I have one of the jungle, I have one of the greenhouse, and one of the garden. And you can just stick these around your classroom and literally walk to each station and practice the different pronunciations. So practicing it clearly, like in the greenhouse. So they've been. Then you can walk to the garden and pronounce it more connected. So they've been. And then sleeping good and bad. That's the jungle. You don't need to show all this phonemic script. It's just here for you today for your reference. And also notice the numbers on the bottom are the reduced sounds. So starting with 19 individual sounds gets reduced down to 12. The second activity is what Cauldwell calls mush, replacing words. So you can choose a particular feature, a pronunciation feature you want to focus on. In this case, the feature is the hiss effect, when the S drowns out sounds around it. Mush here refers to the sounds, like what do we actually hear? I've got the symbols there for you. And it replaces the citation forms that are underlined there. So we've already done number 1. So they've been good and bad. Sounds like C, sleeping good and bad. I'll give you 5 seconds. See if you can match the other ones. All right. What about number 2? Which one does that match with? Yep. 2 is A. Good, scan on. What about 3? What's number 3 match with? 3's D. Says it's going to be great. It's going to be great. And then, of course, the last one, piece of cake. Piece of cake. You can keep the same concept and take parts of this tape script and replace some of the words with mush, or what the words actually sound like. For example, scan on says it's going to be great. After that, you can ask the students to tell you what the actual words are. So scan What are the actual words for scan? The actual words are what is going. And the actual words for scumby is it is going to be, reduces down to scumby. And again, you can take that further and get them to do the botanic walk. Get them to practice the different pronunciation. And just a note, Cauldwell always says, if you can say it, you can hear it. And the idea is that it will help you to have an awareness of the way the sounds change. It's not that we want our students to talk like the jungle. We don't need, you don't want them to have to speak like this. The purpose for them to speak, say these words in the jungle is to raise that awareness when they're trying to decode. Another activity is minimal pairs. So circle what you hear.
So they've been good and bad.
What's the answer for that? 1 or 2. What did you hear? Yeah, number 2. Actually, when I hear this now, my brain is hearing sleeping, playing tricks on me, but yes, it's number 2. Another one is dictation. So you can, again, choose a decoding issue. I've chosen here ja, and I'll dictate some sentences or questions with that feature, and then students write that down. So, for example, oh, I didn't write my questions down. 1 moment. My first question will be, what you doing? Can anyone quickly type what I just said? What you doing? Good. What are you doing? Next one is, do you have a good time? And do you know what I mean? So students, you can repeat as many times. Oh, you guys are fast. Repeat as many times as the students need. They write that down, and they should have these questions. Then ask them to circle. Where is that sound? Where's that j sound? So number 1, that would be what ja, what you doing? And number 2 would be the first 2 words, do you have a good time? And the last one would be, do you know what I mean? And again, go on a botanic walk. You can practice the jungle pronunciation, the greenhouse, and the garden. Back chaining is an oldie, but a goodie. Choose a phrase. The difference here is that what we want them to do is practice the jungle pronunciation, because it's the jungle that they have trouble decoding. So if we choose this phrase, of course, you don't need to show this to your students. You can just do, call and response. So I would say ba, you respond with ba, and I go mba, good bad, been good and bad, been good and bad, they've been good and bad, so they've been good and bad. So call and response. And then was that my last one? That was 5. That was 5. All right, awesome. So that there are some that's the 5 activities. So botanic walk, mush replaces words, minimal pairs, dictation, and back chaining. And here are some other ideas you can investigate. Cauldwell has an excellent site. It's called Speech in Action. He's got worksheets. He's got activities. I highly recommend you check them out. Tube Quizit is a great one. It's movies, and they usually focus on a particular feature, and they listen for that and fill in the gap. Same for lyrics training, except for instead of movies, it's songs. Singing songs is really good. Youglish and knock-knock jokes. Anyway, explore that. I'll skip that for now because we're running out of time. Here's the QR code for the Padlet. There's my email. I'll come back to the code. I do have the references. So that'll be on the recording. You can check that out. And thank you, everyone. Thank you for listening. I hope it's been useful. Any questions? Maybe put them, I think we were going to suggest to put them in the Q&A box.
Tanya, there was a question in the chat, which I'm just repeating for you so you can see it at the end from Claudia. Oh, did you see it?
No.
Oh, I can relay it to you anyway. If you do have any questions, just pop them in the Q&A box.
Yeah, because messages are coming through, the
Yeah.
bounces
So
away
the
from
question was, were the students just given that brief clause, or was it put into a context with the clauses that you were using before in the activities?
Yeah, like for example, so they've been good and bad. It was part of a discussion, and so they had some like main ideas, just questions first, and then there were a few phrases that they had to just write the next words. So yeah, there was more context, and there was an activity where they focused on comprehension first, like what are they talking about, and then there was more specific practice where they had to listen for the specific words.
Okay, great. There's another question from Becky, and she's asked, what conversations do you have with your students around overusing transcription software or translators? Interesting question. So yeah, I mean, obviously a common issue with listening activities.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I guess you always have to remember, like, what are you wanting? What's the purpose of using it? So I always get them to listen without a transcription first, because obviously, well, if you want to practice reading, yes, use subtitles, transcriptions, that's great. But I guess it's like, what are you using the transcriptions for? I think transcriptions are useful, like you can manipulate them, or you can check what they're saying, but then compare it to what it actually sounds like. So I do that. I use that with Youglish. It's really useful because Youglish, you can put in a phrase or a word and a whole bunch of videos appear, and it shows you what they're saying, but it also shows you how it's pronounced. So they have to make a connection between what they see and what it actually sounds like. So it's, yeah, I think they're useful. I just you have to be clear. Ask them, what do you want? What are you using them for? What are you using it for? And maybe suggest how you can use it to help with decoding.
Yeah, okay, great. There's another question from NASA. They've asked if you think decoding improves naturally through exposure, because they feel that it might be a bit time consuming and hard for learners to, really labor this during class time with the different sound combinations. So if someone's, in Australia for a long time, would it naturally improve through exposure, the decoding? Or do you think really raising this awareness makes the process a lot quicker?
100%. I think raising awareness is really important, and it doesn't need to be time consuming.
Yep.
So for example, I've just started a class this week, and I always notice myself saying, oh, what do I say? Did you have a good time, or do you know what I mean? Actually, that's a bad question as a teacher, but and then I go, oh, what do you think that means? And then every time this week I noticed that change, like, would you like me to help you? I go, oh, would you? And I just kind of pause for a moment and say, oh, there's that sound again. Or we go, did you notice, like, I write the phrase, did you hear the sound j? Where was it? It
Yeah.
doesn't need to be like a whole lesson. It just can be like you pause for a moment. Even one of my students today heard loan instead of alone, and just sharing that you know, understanding where the word boundaries are can be difficult. So it doesn't have to be too time consuming.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess some people it would naturally happen, and some people it may not, really, depending on, you know,
Yeah, and I
the
feel when you
natural
start the
circumstances.
process, it might be a catalyst for them just to do it by themselves.
Yeah.
They'll start to go, oh, I just noticed that change.
Yeah, bring in examples that they hear outside of class as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. There are many possible sound combinations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I believe that's the end of the questions, and many words of thanks and praise for your session in the chat as well, Tanja. So thank you so much. You know, I really love those powerful metaphors of the jungle, the greenhouse, and the garden, but also getting the students to walk around the classroom with the images, I think is a great activity. And also, I think your point about really taking the time to explore what students are hearing without the bias of our blur gap and really dig down deep into that, I think for me was really powerful as well. And thank you for sharing all of those practical activities and resources too.
Thank you, Sophie. Thank you for having me, and thanks for everyone joining us today. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks, Tanja, and thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you. Bye-bye.